This is Dan Schneider, and this is the third Dan Schneider video interview. And on today's topic, we will be discussing Loren Eiseley, a noted American naturalist. The two men that you see on the screen are Bing Chen and Tom Lynch, the president and vice president of the Loren Eiseley Society. And we will discuss who Eiseley was and why he has a society named after him. Welcome back. And Bing, Tom, thank you for being my guests.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Yes, and since most people are going to not know who Loren Eiseley was, since it's almost 4 decades since his death, the two things I'd like to establish in this section is who was Loren Eiseley, a brief summary of his life and career, and then secondly, why there was a society founded for him and what the society's aims are. And as I said, we'll go into depth more on both Eiseley and the society, but just to lay the groundwork, would one of you like to start on who Eiseley was?
Okay, maybe I'll talk about Eiseley and Bing can talk about the society a
Okay.
little bit. Yeah, Loren Eiseley today is best known for being a nature writer, somebody who wrote about the human relationship to the natural world. He was, in fact, professionally an anthropologist by training, but by avocation, he was a poet and a writer, and and he's been extremely influential on the subsequent generation of environmental writers. When I meet various authors and I mention that I'm involved with Loren Eiseley, they almost invariably say, "Oh, I love Loren Eiseley's work. He was a big influence on me. I read him when I was, a teenager, and he set me on my path." So he's really been very influential on today's generation of authors who are writing about the human relationship to the natural world.
And as far as Eiseley, his career, was he a practicing scientist? Did he go out into the field as well?
He did some of that. He slowly worked his way into administration, university administration, actually. He's really not best known for his scientific discoveries. He's not,
Hmm.
that wasn't his major forte. He did, a lot of the field work, quote unquote, that gets into his writing was actually stuff that he did when he was a student at the University of Nebraska. He went out on, he was doing a double major in English and anthropology, and he would go out with the South Party to do from Laurel Hall to do excavations out in western Nebraska and adjoining states, and so he dug up. Bing's holding up the fossil there, the famous innocent assassins fossil that Eiseley found. So a lot of what you read in his later writing, where he's out doing field work. He's actually, I think of it as a sort of work study student. Well, they didn't have that program then, but it was basically that sort of a thing.
Now, Eiseley lived from 1907 to 1977. Was he sort of what you'd call a proto uh, environmentalist? Would you consider him sort of a godfather of that kind of movement? Or he was he. What I'm trying to ask is, was he more of a scientist, or was he more of what might be considered a guru for nature environmentalism kind of thing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he wasn't much of an activist oriented. He wasn't like, say, an Edward Abbey or somebody who, sort of pushed people towards activism. He was more contemplative, more philosophical in his writing. Um, More interested in things like how evolution affects human society and things of that sort. So while his involvement was very much about the environment, his writing is very much about the environment and very much also about human harm to the environment. In particular, I would actually say in some ways he's probably more connected to the animal rights movement than to the larger environmental movement because he was always very concerned about the treatment of animals, including in scientific work that he sometimes witnessed. Um, so I would say that in that way he's more significant in terms of getting people to think about the human connections to the natural world than he is, let's say, a Rachel Carson who has a lot in common with in other ways, but or an Ed Abbey who had a sort of more activist agenda.
Okay. Now, let's turn to the actual society then. In the break there, you guys were telling me that you weren't the founders of the society. So, Bing, maybe you could give us a little insight. Since Eiseley did die in '77, was the society founded after his death or while he was alive, and what brought it about?
Right. The original name of the Loren Eiseley Society was Friends of Loren Eiseley, and it was founded by three people. One was a paleontologist by the name of Bertrand Schultz. Another was Ruth Thone, who was at the time her husband was governor of the state of Nebraska, and the third was a journalist who worked in Lincoln, and his name was Dick Herman. So I'm told that these three people were the people who really founded the Friends of Loren Eiseley, which would morph into the Loren Eiseley Society in 2006, 2007 is when we morphed into with a different perspective on Eiseley,
Yeah.
which is more um, to present Eiseley's body of work and reintroduce it to a new generation of young people. Um, my original introduction to Eiseley really was as a senior in engineering, and our dean, associate dean at the time, Jim Blackman, said, "Well, I think you engineers probably might like to read something that's a little less technical engineering and more to gain a greater perspective on life." And so he presented a number of books from a group of Nebraska authors, and I saw The Immense Journey. And coming from New York City, I found that intriguing. And the only thing I remember from my senior year now is how much the book The Immense Journey had an impact on me. And this impact would carry on for another 40 years, and I would meet other people who were also influenced by Eiseley. One of the members of our board, for instance, is a retired minister who used Eiseley's writings in a lot of his sermons. We have people who are, as you would expect, heads of nature centers who are also very pro-Eiseley. The one that and the society has been driven of late more towards trying to do educational outreach and to revive Eiseley's name.
Okay.
One of the things that occurred, as I have friends on both the East Coast and West Coast, is that Eiseley was very, very popular in the 60s and 70s. And his writings were particularly, I have a good friend who taught at Berkeley. He said they used Eiseley as one of the models, one of the authors that they actually taught informally at Berkeley. And I found that interesting. I also have friends in the East Coast in Boston, and I remember having attending a cocktail party where we were talking about natural writers on nature, and of course Thoreau was brought up, and that was the principal discussion. And then I brought up the name Loren Eiseley, and they all recognized him. They said what a marvelous writer he was and wonderful prose. And then I happened to mention, he's from Lincoln, Nebraska, and there was a pause, and the people there looked at me. One of them said, "Well, Loren Eiseley may be from Lincoln, Nebraska, but I'm sure we know him far better here in Harvard Square than the people of Nebraska." And so that struck me, and I was determined to go back to, when I came back to teach, was to find out and quiz my students how many of them had actually heard of Loren Eiseley. And over you might call this very informal straw poll of my entering freshman students, I found that statement is largely true. Most of my students have never heard of Loren Eiseley nor read any of his works. And so one of the things that we endeavored to do here with the society was to create a new mission. And that mission was to reintroduce Eiseley back into his home state, and that's what the society principal mission has been ever since.
And just so that we can plug the society, I will have a link underneath the video to the Loren Eiseley Society. What does it cost to join, and what are the membership benefits, by the way?
The membership cost, I believe, is $25 a year, and we have the benefits include discounts to the Bison Press, I believe it's called. Tom, is that correct?
Oh yeah, but the University of Nebraska Press has kept all of Eiseley's books in print,
Okay.
and so you can get a discount on purchasing through their subsidiary press called Bison Books. There, so if you want to purchase his books, there's a discount there.
Okay. Now, let me just say though, so the Eiseley Society is not trying to become, say, an Audubon Society. It's basically more,
Oh no,
yeah,
yeah.
it's more centered on the man and his ideas and propounding them.
Yeah, it's there's it's an author oriented organization, trying to promote Eiseley, and then the values that Eiseley's work represents. But it's definitely focused on him. It's not an environmental activist organization. There are others of those that a lot of us are involved with, but it's not one.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and when we come back for the next segment, let's talk more in depth about the life and career of Loren Eiseley, who he was, where he came from, and also his great autobiography, All the Strange Hours. So that'll be up in our next segment then. Okay, gentlemen. In this segment, I want to focus on the life, the biography of Loren Eiseley, where he came from, how he grew up, what he studied. Talk also about his autobiography, All the Strange Hours. But before we do that, let's. Bing had given a little bit of background information about himself and how he got into Eiseley. So let me just ask you, Tom, to start off. What do you do at the University of Nebraska, and how did you get involved? Find Eiseley. Was he a childhood hero or what?
Well, I'm an English professor in Lincoln, and I teach primarily environmental literature, so that's a pretty direct connection to Eiseley there. Well, I actually discovered Eiseley when I was a freshman at the University of Arizona many years ago. Too many to to count, and I was actually at the time I was going to be an astronomy major, so I had a disinterest in science, and I did, and in my freshman comp course, that dreaded class so many people hate to take, one of the books we read was The Immense Journey, and I was just really struck by that, and it really sort of brought together my interests in both the natural world and in writing and literature, and it just stayed with me. Ever after, it sort of inspired me to start reading other nature writers. I tracked down Joseph Wood Crouch, who had been living in Tucson at the time as well, and sort of my interest in. I think it probably made me realize that there are people writing about this sort of stuff that I found interesting, even if they weren't prominently taught in the traditional English courses. So that was really my introduction to Eiseley. I like to joke with Bing that when I first read Eiseley, he made Nebraska seem very exotic. Nebraska has a reputation as being a rather boring, no nonsense, but just sort of plain state with nothing much interesting. But when you read Eiseley, it just seems like it's the most mysterious and exotic sort of a place one can imagine. So I guess I always had that lingering in the back of my mind about this state, even when everybody else was thinking it was just cornfields. And then I ended up making a career out of studying the sort of thing that Loren Eiseley did, and so it's just a kind of big circuit to wind up totally by accident teaching in his hometown, and thought, well, I better turn my attention back to Loren Eiseley.
Okay, now Bing, what do you do at the university?
I am a professor in electrical and computer engineering
Okay.
uh, at the Omaha campus. And my involvement with Eiseley was that discovery as a senior. And I also teach a course called Technology, Science, and Civilization, which is a finishing course for our seniors in the department. And I frequently will take pieces of Eiseley's writings as an introduction to each lecture. And we actually do begin with literally the technology and the scientific tools that we have that allow us to peer all the way back to the Big Bang, all the way to the present, and then stepping into the future. And with each of these segments, I have a tendency to choose a snippet from one of Eiseley's writings, very heavily from The Immense Journey, and his most famous book, well, that's his most famous book, as well as from the one of his later books called The Invisible Pyramid, which focuses on mankind in the 20th century, or as Eiseley likes to refer to it, the rocket century.
Okay. Now let's stick. Let's get into Eiseley himself. As I mentioned earlier, he was born in 1907 to German parents. Was he a first or second generation immigrant? And what do we know about the background of his parents? Were they involved in science or what?
No, I don't think there was much scientific training in his family at all. His father was a sort of traveling salesman who was also very fond of Shakespeare and would declaim Shakespeare passages around the house. But his father was gone much of the time. He came from a very poor background, rather troubled family life. Exactly how troubled we speculate. Nobody's quite sure, but it was his father's second marriage, and and Eiseley always felt like he was sort of an afterthought a bit, that his father's first marriage and his child by that marriage was his, the one that mattered, and Loren was sort of just the kid who came along later. That he writes about that in his autobiography a bit there. So I don't know how true that is, but it certainly was his impression of his upbringing. And his mother, um, well known that she was deaf and had a hard time communicating with him, and he found her embarrassing out in public, and was alienated from her, and so difficult, a fairly difficult childhood that he had there, and he found a sort of solace and escape by in two big ways. One of them was going to the public library, the Lincoln Public Library. There's stories of him with his little red wheelbarrow walking back and forth down the sidewalks with a wagon, a little red wagon, filled with books. And then the other was, at the time, his family lived on the edge of town. Now the city's grown way beyond their house, and he would go off into the woods and the fields and the creeks and explore. And so that sort of books and nature were his sort of escape from a somewhat difficult home life.
I know for me personally, back when I was 12 or 13 and I first read Eiseley, the Night Country essays slash stories, and I was talking to Bing a few weeks
Yeah.
ago about their personal hidden essay, and I'll get into that a little bit
Right.
later with you guys. But it, I always remembered that there's one of them where he's talking about going down into the sewers of the
Right.
town,
Right.
and I, growing up in New York City, had a lot of adventures subterraneanly too,
I did.
and
I did as well.
and
Yeah.
so that always stuck with me. So what do we know about Eiseley's teenage years? Was he a troubled teenager? Was he a Lothario with the girls? Was he an A student? I think he in his late teens did start hoboing, didn't he? Did he not?
No, yeah, he did. Well, yeah, he actually it was his college years, I think, primarily. He
Yeah.
he had a difficult time in high school, and he wound up finishing high school at a special high school that the university had set up as a sort of experimental school, which is actually where he met his wife, who was his teacher at the time. There, they did marry many years later, but he had I seem to have a hard time fitting into the academic lifestyle of high school. as many people do actually, and especially many people who are, a bit eccentric and also very smart. But he also had, seemed to be a fairly normal life as well. He played. We have pictures of him in a football uniform, which is always important in Nebraska. And he seemed to have a social life that wasn't. He wasn't extremely alienated. I think he was somewhat reserved and whatnot. But I wouldn't. Doesn't seem to have been anything too extreme about it. But he did eventually do the hoboing, which is an interesting chapter in his life because Lincoln's a big railroad town, so he could hop the freights on the edge of town. And it was the period of time when people were doing that. People were traveling the country, and he would take a semester off when he was at the university, skip a semester and ride the rails out to California, and come back and resume his studies. So that's a fairly intriguing period of his life, actually, the hoboing, and it's always resulted in him. In his later in his writings, even if it's not hobos exactly, he's often very drawn to homeless people he sees on park benches or riding the subways. Unlike most of us, he doesn't move away from those folks. He often, at least in his writings, he moves towards them. He strikes up a conversation, and I think that's a kind of legacy from that hoboing days. Even when he was a provost at a university, he still would sit down on a park bench next to some homeless man, strike up a conversation.
And how about his college days? Where did he study? What did he study? And like the 1930s, the pre-war years, how did he establish himself?
Well, he went to the University of Nebraska here, was an English major and anthropology major. Apparently he wrote so well that the story is that one of his English professors accused him of plagiarism, said you couldn't have written this, and the professor couldn't prove it, but Eiseley was pretty irritated at that, and that was one of the reasons supposedly he was drawn into anthropology then instead. He worked for the literary journal Prairie Schooner, which is still thriving, but it was started back in the 30s at the university. It was one of the earliest of the little magazines. There's these series of small poetry and short fiction literary journals. It was one of the early ones, and started at the university by Professor Lowry Wimberly, and Loren got on the staff, and a lot of his earliest publications are in the first couple of years of Prairie Schooner, a lot of his early poetry. And he actually was a fairly widely published poet at that time. He was in a poetry magazine, which was publishing people like Ezra Pound and Wallace Stevens and people like that. His poetry when he was in his early 20s, and seemed to have sort of hung around with a kind of a literary group, a well-connected literary group there. He was a big fan of Robinson Jeffers' poetry. Oh, yeah. Very influenced by that.
A natural connection there, yes.
Yeah, right. Something people need to explore a little better, I think. There's an article there. So he. But then he drifted away from poetry and literary writing once he went to grad school and was studying anthropology, and then he had to publish, more scientific sorts of work, and but then he came back to it later in his life, started doing creative writing again. But he sort of began as a creative writer, and then had this big intervening period of professional work, and then came back to creative writing some more as he approached retirement.
Now, Bing, we had conversed a couple of weeks ago about the Ray Bradbury connection with Loren Eiseley, and you were telling me that Bradbury was actually the fellow who pushed Eiseley into publishing his essays. Can you tell us a bit about that period of his life, his sort of middle period?
Sure. He had published an essay in Harper's, which was called The Fire Apes, and Ray Bradbury came upon this, and Ray claims this was the year 1946. It's also on our video brief video of Ray Bradbury on our website. And upon seeing this, Ray opined, he said, wow, this is really an excellent piece of work. And so he he wrote Eiseley via the magazine and said, I think you have a great deal of talent, and I should put these essays together and write a book. And Eiseley, of course, was very flattered that someone of Ray Bradbury's reputation would take the time to write him and encourage him. And so he took Bradbury's advice and collected his essays into what would become what Tom and I would both read later on, The Immense Journey.
Yeah.
And in meeting with Mr. Bradbury, he would indicate to me, he said, you know, Bing, I thought this was probably one of the best essays written about nature in the 20th century. And in fact, I regard Eiseley as perhaps one of the most eminent of all nature writers of that time, and one that would go on to influence so many others. And so he also had an opportunity when Eiseley, as provost at the University of Pennsylvania, and became famous from The Immense Journey, would be asked to give lectures. And on one occasion, Bradbury attended one of his presentations, and here's Eiseley reading like this off of the paper to the audience. And Bradbury told me that he stopped the talk, went up and pulled the paper away from him and said, you don't need to be reading this. Emote it, feel it, share it with the audience. Your prose will carry you. And so I put down his notes and just started speaking extemporaneously, and I guess that became Eiseley's style from that point on. Bradbury really was a great thing. There's a film that was created on public television called Reflections of a Bone Hunter, which was produced several decades ago. And in it, Bradbury's given a fairly significant piece of an interview of why he was influenced by Loren Eiseley and why he encouraged Eiseley to write as much as he could.
Now, how was Eiseley viewed by his contemporaries, both at Lincoln, Nebraska, and also in the publishing world and the science world?
Oh boy, I think once he left Lincoln, I think he never really came back except for very brief visits, and I think not that well known here. I think Bing was right there that sort of like a prophet is without honor in his hometown. You know, I think he was somewhat forgotten there. He obviously became a significant author in the 50s and 60s there. So in the publishing world, I think he was pretty well respected as somebody who wrote some important books and could get his work published. He apparently was extremely sensitive to negative reviews. However, more so than writers ought to be, just for their own mental health. I think his scientist friends were pretty dubious about a lot of the more literary, poetic kinds of writing that he did. One of the things he wrote about was that two cultures phenomenon that C.P. Snow made famous in that period of the art is drifting in one direction and the sciences drifting in another direction, and even when they're on the same campus, say, they never meet. There's no interaction between them, and Eiseley was somebody who bridged those worlds. But I would say, on the one hand, his literary writing did not always meet with favor amongst the more rigorous scientists of his acquaintance, and especially his later poetry in particular it has some pretty significant science in it that didn't always sit well with some of the poetry, aficionados of that period as well. But in some ways, I think that's actually Eiseley's greatest legacy, though, is this insistence on trying to bring the sciences and the humanities and arts together. So like E.O. Wilson today, or there's a few writers like that who are sort of in his tradition. But
Yeah, I know. I've interviewed a few scientists myself, and I've also known others, and I've been surprised at how few even know the name Loren Eiseley. And
yeah,
I personally consider him sort of the father of what I consider the last 30 or 40 years, the golden age of science writing, with people like a
right,
Jacob Bronowski, then a Carl
right,
Sagan, a Stephen Jay Gould, not
right.
just because of the science, but because of the quality of the writing and the ability to engage readers, especially young readers. Let's just end with three things. What was Eiseley, since he would have been active in the 50s, 60s, 70s? What were his politics, number one? Secondly, let's talk about his marriage, since in his autobiography, I don't recall him mentioning his wife by name. My wife said he does say it once. I thought he didn't. One of the interesting things in the autobiography is so little he says about his own personal life, children or whatnot. Uh,
Right.
and then the third thing, let's talk about how he died. So let's go with the political thing. For what was his politics? Was he involved in politics or what?
He wasn't particularly involved in politics, and he became increasingly conservative, which is a bit of a puzzle to a lot of his fans. I think it's fair to say that certainly I was, and I think a lot of people who were reading Eiseley in the 70s, were fairly countercultural types.
Yeah.
They sort of appreciated Eiseley's critique of sort of the objective science, his sort of claims to objectivity that seemed suspect in a lot of science. They were attracted to his concern for animal rights issues. They were obviously was the environmental movement had caught on big. So there were a lot of features of Eiseley's writing that appealed to folks, say, on the left side of the political spectrum. And in fact, also he didn't do a lot on this, but he was quite a champion of the civil rights movement in his writing. His work on anthropology and
Yeah.
whatnot told him that racial discrimination had no merit. There was no basis for it. So, but then, especially as the sort of the hippie movement started, he was really turned off by that. I think for a lot of reasons. I think one of them was sort of a deep reason is I think he felt that human societies, flawed as they were a fairly fragile bulwark against sort of chaos and sort of degradation of human culture. And so he wasn't into the sort of idea that we can just change all of the institutions of society. He was sort of alarmed by that and thought that would be more likely lead to chaos than it would be to lead to any sort of a utopian society that people thought it would. And he may be right about that. I don't know. I think he definitely, and this is one of the ways he opens his autobiography, is as sort of a critique of the free love era. He was really turned off by the sort of new attitudes towards sexuality that the counterculture was bringing.
Well, Tom, I always was under the impression too, and it's been a few years since I read All the Strange Hours, but I had the impression that he was not big on drug usage as well, because I
Yeah,
think
no, yeah, I'm sure that's part of it as well. Yeah, I think that's right.
I think he felt it sort of distanced people from reality, and he was very much about dealing with reality.
Yeah, yeah, and there's some other sort of personal things with him. Um, he became a major professor and administrator at one of the country's leading universities, but he grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. Sort of I was saying working class, but even almost barely working class family background there. And a lot of people from those backgrounds, and I have to say, sort of feel that way myself sometimes. I grew up in a working class family. Feel a little bit like posers in the university system, like we're just, like it's never quite our world when we're there, and and he also apparently he never actually finished his PhD dissertation. Nobody's ever been able to find it, and it just seems as though his major professor thought he wrote so well and was so brilliant, he just sort of gave him a pass on actually finishing it there. And it makes me think that he was maybe a bit insecure as a professor in the university system, a little sensitive to being challenged. And one of the things that, one of the effects of the counterculture university system was that students began to challenge their professors, began to challenge their authority. And this was the period when the student evaluations came in as well, right? So that students would then be able to sit down and rate their professors. That's something we're still doing. But that was a new innovation that was a response to the sort of the counterculture's critique of the authority of the professor. And I always have the sense that he was a bit insecure and therefore defensive when that thing happened. I can't prove that, but that's sort of my reading between the lines a little bit of.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment with just on a bit on his personal life, his marriage and death. Then, and I don't ask in a prurient sense, but as a person, a poet myself. I know that a lot of times artists propound things in their art that they never live. The best example I can give is the German language poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote some of the greatest, most spiritual poems about life, love, existence. But he was a rotten son of a bitch in real life. He was a terrible father. He abused mentally and possibly physically some of the women he was involved. He cheated, he lied, steal, blah. Was Eiseley in a good marriage? Was it a loving marriage? Who did he marry? And how did he die? He died at what, the age of 69 or 70. So let's talk about that a little bit here, just for a couple of minutes.
Well, I can talk a little bit about his marriage. As you say, first off, he writes an autobiography where his wife is maybe mentioned once. It's really striking. Although as other people have pointed out, he titles his autobiography "All the Strange Hours," not all the normal hours, right?
Yeah.
So he actually is sort of highlighting those features of his life that are not the day-to-day ordinary life there. But he had met her when he, like I mentioned earlier, when he was a high school student, and he was probably 17 and she was probably in her early 20s. It wasn't a big age difference there. Not that they struck up a relationship at that time, but I think probably they noticed each other, shall we say.
And what was her name, actually?
Oh, Mabel Langdon. Yeah.
Okay.
Mabel, and then later they met through other people, and as they got older, became more appropriate, I guess, for them to have a relationship. But it was unusual. Not to psychoanalyze them too much, but it was fairly unusual at that time for men to marry women older than they were.
Yeah.
And,
Well, Jeff
she
does
does seem to have fulfilled a kind of mothering role in his life that, sort of worked behind the scenes to make sure that he got where he needed to go, and she helped with his writing, and she sort of took on that sort of a role in his life. But by all accounts, a very happy marriage.
Did they have children?
Did they have children? No, they didn't have children. No.
Okay.
Eiseley actually thought that his family, actually not thought, there was some insanity in his family line, and he believed that he should not pass on those genes to the future. So they did not have any children.
And how did he die?
It was cancer, wasn't it? He developed cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, he had cancer, and I actually have a letter that he wrote to one of the people that I met in Amherst recently, and her name is Shalamith, and she told me that she got to know Eiseley and wanted to visit with him, and he had written her back to say that he was suffering an illness at that time. I believe it was 1969, and that he was recovering, and he was looking forward to meeting her.
Yeah.
And
So it was long term then, because if it's 69, he died in 77. The last decade of his life he must have been ill.
I'm sorry, it was 1976.
76. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's end this segment then, and in the next segment we'll talk about his career as a science. So basically, what he was interested in, how that infused his writing, and that stuff. We're going to end this segment with I have a little special treat. We have a bit of film that Bing and the website provided of a documentary on Eiseley. That'll come up in a little bit. And then I have two sections of essays being read by my wife, Jessica. The first one will end this section, and it's from the essay, The Judgment of the Birds. So we'll listen to that, or you, the viewers, will. And when we come back, we'll talk about Loren Eiseley and his career as a scientist.
Loren Eiseley, from The Judgment of the Birds. I have said that I saw judgment upon life, and that it was not passed by men. Those who stare at birds in cages, or who test minds by their closeness to our own, may not care for it. It comes from far away, out of my past, in a place of pouring waters and green leaves. I shall never see an episode like it again if I live to be 100, nor do I think that one man in a million has ever seen it, because man is an intruder into such silences. The light must be right, and the observer must remain unseen. No man sets up such an experiment. What he sees by chance. You may put it that I had come over a mountain, that I had slogged through fern and pine needles for half a long day, and that on the edge of a little glade with one long crooked branch extending across it, I had sat down to rest with my back against a stump. Through accident I was concealed from the glade, although I could see into it perfectly. The sun was warm there, and the murmurs of forest life blurred softly away into my sleep. When I awoke, dimly aware of some commotion and outcry in the clearing, the light was slanting down through the pines in such a way that the glade was lit like some vast cathedral. I could see the dust motes of wood pollen in the long shaft of light, and there on the extended branch sat an enormous raven with a red and squirming nestling in his beak. The sound that awoke me was the outraged cries of the nestling's parents, who flew helplessly in circles about the clearing. The sleek black monster was indifferent to them. He gulped, wetted his beak on the dead branch a moment, and sat still. Up to that point, the little tragedy had followed the usual pattern. But suddenly, out of all that area of woodland, a soft sound of complaint began to rise. Into the glade fluttered small birds of half a dozen varieties, drawn by the anguished outcries of the tiny parents. No one dared to attack the raven, but they cried there in some instinctive common misery, the bereaved and the unbereaved. The glade filled with their soft rustling and their cries. They fluttered as though to point their wings at the murderer. There was a dim, intangible ethic he had violated. That they knew. He was a bird of death. And he, the murderer, the black bird at the heart of life, sat on there, glistening in the common light, formidable, unmoving, unperturbed, untouchable. The sighing died. It was then I saw the judgment. It was the judgment of life against death. I will never see it again so forcefully presented. I will never hear it again in notes so tragically prolonged. For in the midst of protests they forgot the violence. There, in that clearing, the crystal note of a song sparrow lifted hesitantly into the hush. And finally, after painful fluttering, another took the song, and then another, the song passing from one bird to another, doubtfully at first, as though some evil thing were being slowly forgotten, till suddenly they took heart and sang from many throats joyously together as birds are known to sing. They sang because life is sweet and sunlight beautiful. They sang under the brooding shadow of the raven. In simple truth, they had forgotten the raven, for they were the singers of life and not of death.
The life and career of Loren Eiseley, American naturalist. Bing, we had talked a few weeks ago on the phone about Loren Eiseley, and you'd described an interesting anecdote where earlier I think Tom had mentioned how a lot of the scientific peers sort of looked down a bit on Eiseley as a scientist and a thinker. What was the anecdote that you had told me about how Eiseley was vindicated decades after his death?
Yes, one of his essays in the immense journey is called The Last Neanderthal. Actually, it's in Unexpected Universe, and in it he recounts one of his expeditions as a member of the South Party into the Wildcat Hills of Nebraska. And here they were trying to find bones from some hippopotamus or rhinoceros. And after a day's work, they would come down to their encampment, which was in a hollow, and there was a small pond which they would bathe in. And he described this young lady, the daughter of the farm owner, who would deliver milk and eggs to them. And he looked at her, and she became the inspiration for the essay, The Last Neanderthal, so he uses this essay to describe what humankind may have been like 30 or 40,000 years ago. In the literature, he was then criticized for taking too much poetic license, that the Neanderthals had actually passed from the scene 30,000 years ago, and that this was too far of a stretch. And so a number of his colleagues in anthropology and paleontology criticized him for this. It turns out, however, that since his death, when we start looking at DNA analysis today, it turns out that a significant portion of Europeans do happen to harbor DNA from Neanderthals, and that the population, the percentage of Europeans is perhaps 6-7%. Percentage of Africans, for instance, is 0. So the part of our species that did not emigrate out of Africa has remained, you might say, pure strain compared to some of the cousins who have emigrated to other portions of the world. So to a certain Europeans and then Asians, to a certain extent, do carry DNA from Neanderthals today. So it turns out, actually, Eiseley was correct and his peers were wrong.
It's probably got Hitler spinning in his grave, because probably the most pure Homo sapiens then turn out to be the dark Africans, whereas the mutts are the Europeans.
That's right.
So let's talk about the rest of him as a scientist, and we'll get, like I said, in the next segment, him as a writer of prose, and also deal with his poetry in a bit. But what was Eiseley scientifically most known for? Because I do know that he probably his least poetic book, off the top of my head, I've got all of his stuff, but he wrote a long book on the life of a scientist, I think in the 15 or 1600s, and it's a very dry text.
Francis Bacon, yeah.
Right. It was the Bacon. So what was he most known for scientifically, basically?
Well, that book, interestingly, suggests that he actually had quite a strong interest in the history of science itself, which was not really much of a field at that time, but has
Yeah.
become an important field. Now there are a lot of history departments have somebody who that's what they are. They're the historian of science, and it is useful to, and this of course doesn't enamor him to his colleagues, but it's useful to look at the historical evolution of science and scientific ideology and the scientific method, and realize that it's sort of conditioned by historical and social forces. It's not some sort of absolutely pure uh, process that's distinct from the rest of society there. So that's not really a scientific breakthrough per so much, but it is certainly an important insight that he had that of science as a historically generated way of thinking.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead.
so
Go ahead.
one of the let me add to what Tom has said. The two people that he has done a biography of happen to be two of the significant people that I use in some of my classes when I teach history of science. One is Sir Francis Bacon, and the other is Charles Darwin. And so these two people formed of the two people that he would choose. I find it interesting. Would basically predict the rise of the way that universities are run today as scientific establishments that are team driven. And Charles Darwin, who uh, uh, created a tremendous controversy in his day with the origin of species, and who Eiseley identifies with. And I think these two people are in Eiseley's mind, two of the giants who would shape Western thought and also scientific thought as we move into the 20th century as a major conceptual idea, evolution.
Yeah. I mean, you really can't understand Eiseley without understanding evolution. And evolution is really everywhere in his writing. He's really trying to think about what are the implications for society of Darwin's ideas. I mean, so much of his writing is involved with that.
And I think for me, the two things stick out about Eiseley to me. One is that he seemed to see the whole more than his contemporaries. And I think
Right.
of an essay like, I think it's titled "How the Flowers Changed the World."
Right, right.
And then I also, and I had mentioned this to Bing in an earlier conversation, as a young boy, I loved to read science books, and I preferred them over comic books, and I still remember a little book from the early 70s I had about Louis Agassiz and the glaciers, and how he waited 20 years for the body of a dead hiker to come down at the end of a glacier. And I always have this idea of Eiseley writing about sort of the looming ice age. So I always associate in my mind Eiseley more with sort of Cenozoic mastodons and mammoths, more so than
Right.
dinosaurs.
Yeah. That actually brings up that when you're talking about what his period he studied, that was his real period. His period was the sort of late ice age,
Yeah.
in North America. That's what he did his research on, and one of his important findings was there was a dig out near Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where they had found human artifacts mingled with an extinct species of bison fossils out there, Bison antiquus, but they couldn't prove that they were contemporaries with each other. A lot of people argued that no, those human artifacts just sort of got mixed in, washed down the stream together with the others, and he actually found a fulsome point embedded in the vertebrae of a bison antiquus, proving that somebody had shot that arrow into that bison, and that helped to push the understanding of human occupation of North America back about 5,000 years. So that was at the time the idea was that humans had only been in North America a few thousand years, and his discovery pushed that back, and he was very interested in that late ice age period in North America, when humans were still living with some of those animals that have since gone extinct there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned he also did have this idea that we were in an interglacial period.
Yeah.
So when climate change deniers say, well, back in the 60s and 70s, people were predicting a coming ice age. Well, frankly, Isley's one of the guys who actually, he didn't predict it. That's wrong. But he actually speculated about the idea that what would happen if the ice came back.
Yeah.
That was sort of part of his sort of imaginative, as you say, his long-term thinking about this.
Now, let me just
we're living in an interglacial period right now.
Yeah. Let me just ask, you mentioned the Folsom Point. Was Eiseley still alive when they discovered Clovis Points? Did he have
Yeah, no, I'm sure he was. Yeah, but I can't recall offhand what he had to say about that. But yeah,
Okay.
he would have been. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts on his scientific career from either of you?
I think that a lot of what his early contributions would have been was as a member of the South Party. So I think that he was particularly enamored with this exact replica of Nimbarus brachiops, which is a saber-toothed cat from about 26 million years ago. One of the members of his team discovered this, and this would inspire him for a lifetime and lead to his perhaps one of his better-known poems called "The Innocent Assassins."
Yeah.
And
Bing, you mentioned the South Party. Just for people who don't know, just give a brief. What was that? The South Party.
This was a group sent out, sponsored by the University of Nebraska's State Museum, to look for fossils. One of the things about Nebraska that I find curious is that in 93 of the 95 counties, they have found mastodon bones. So Nebraska is a very fossil-rich state, and Eiseley was an active member of that party, and I think a lot of these adventures that he had would be very formative in his later writings.
Okay. So let's end this segment, and when we get back, we will talk about Loren Eiseley as a writer, his prose, and his poetry. So that'll come up just shortly. All right, and we are in this section going to talk about Loren Eiseley as a writer of prose and poetry. And let me just throw this out as someone who's written both myself. It's odd, but I think people in the arts, especially in any kind of genre, tend to excel in one thing or the other. And in writing, I found in over 30 years of being involved in the arts that you can have a great poet, and they usually are not good at prose. And I think of Rainer Maria Rilke and Walt Whitman come to mind as just not writing good prose, even though they wrote sterling poetry. And on the inverse side, you have someone like Herman Melville, who wrote great poetic prose, and his poetry was didactic, stuffy, boring, and whatnot. Well, I think Eiseley was a good, solid poet. I think his prose clearly is his legacy, and it's much more plangent and deep and poetic than even his poetry. So let me just toss that out to you. Would both of you agree with that? And then we'll get a little bit into his books and his whole bibliography. So either of you want to take that on?
Well, definitely his reputation today rests on his prose. If he'd only written poetry, we wouldn't be talking about him here. So I think that's definitely the case. I think he wasn't as bad a poet as is sometimes argued, but I certainly wouldn't say that his main claim to fame is his prose. I mean, his poetry. It's definitely his prose.
Yeah. So let's talk about Eiseley's first book. I know Bing had mentioned Bradbury's involvement. Did Bradbury help him get his first book published, or was he publishing before he met Bradbury?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
We'll probably have to look at his biography to determine that. I know that Bradbury was encouraging him to get all the essays published together into a single volume. I don't know if Bradbury actually influenced publishers to assist Eiseley. So
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. He may have given him some context. That would be my suspicion that he told him send this to so and so, sort of a thing. But
So let me ask both of you then, which would you say is his best book and his most influential book, and then say best book and most liked essay? Let's talk about which ones really drew you into him. Bing, if you want to go first.
oh, thank you. I think for me, The Immense Journey is the first and the one that has stayed me the longest. I think that it really is through his childhood adventures growing up in Nebraska, he uses common things like floating in the Platte River or wandering what he calls the sunflower forest through Lincoln, Nebraska, as markers of the you might say member parts of this, to weave this wonderful tapestry of life on Earth since that great explosion of life. And so he weaves his prose in such a way that he's using very common everyday experiences that he had to mold this picture of what would become The Immense Journey. And one of those essays, perhaps I should let Tom now talk, but one of his most famous essays from this is how flowers change the world. And so that's probably the essay that I am most connected to.
Well, let's just stick with the sunflowers for a second, Bing, because when we had talked earlier too, you had mentioned something about the University of Nebraska having planted a garden full of sunflowers. So, if you could give us that anecdote about the sunflower forest.
Sure. So this is I'm holding a group of sunflowers in front of me, and one of the Lincoln, Nebraska, in the days that Eiseley was a young boy, they had annual floods of their creeks. Salt Creek is the primary creek that flows through Lincoln, Nebraska, and it would scour the land on both sides during flooding. And so what would emerge would be these sunflowers. And as a young boy, 5, 6 years old, he and his band of brothers would go wandering through miles and miles of these forests, and they would wander along the banks, and I think he would end up in a place near Denton, Nebraska, which is a number of miles outside of Lincoln, and this would serve as a great influence on his later writings, and which he uses frequently. And in fact, he begins one of his essays by saying that if I remember the sunflower forest, it is because from its hidden reaches man arose. Green world is a sacred center. In moments of sanity, he must still seek there. And so, the sunflower forest is a ever-repeating theme that he uses. And I remember explaining to Ray Bradbury the context with which he likes to use the word sunflower forest.
And Tom, how about you in regards to essays and books?
I would agree with Bing that the Immense Journey is, I think, definitely his masterpiece. It's more coherent than a lot of his other books, which can be more collections of essays, whereas the Immense Journey is both. Each chapter can be read by itself as a separate, unified, piece of art, but the entire book follows a very clear arc of this. It's the story of evolution. So he uses the story of evolution from the early chapters about water and like Bing mentioned, the flow of the river, to the later chapters about humanity at the end. And I noticed I just taught a course I just finished a course this semester on literature and the environment, and we used the Norton anthology of nature writing in there, and Loren is in there, and that essay that was mentioned by Bing earlier, the one with the name's skipping my mind now, but What's the final essay in there with the story?
What in what the immense journey?
In
The
the men's
final,
journey, yeah.
if the secret of life.
And it's not the secret of life. It's
Well, there's another book that I that it's called The Invisible Pyramid, which
yeah,
is
Okay.
yeah.
he
That's
was
also organized by evolution as well.
right.
Yeah, right,
Okay.
yeah, right. But it's not the secret of life. It's just I'm just drawing a blank on
The
the
meaning
title.
of life. Was it the
Hmm?
meaning of life?
Well, because
Uh,
I'll give you the
yeah,
contents.
yeah,
We got
yeah.
the slit, the flow of the river, the great deeps, the snows, how flowers change the world, the real secret of Piltdown, the
Right.
maze, the dream animal.
Judgment of the birds. That's
Oh,
sorry,
that
sorry, getting
and
old. Judgment of the
and
birds.
that's the one actually that my wife read earlier. You
Yeah,
guys didn't hear
right.
it, but you'll hear it when you watch this.
Sorry about that. But anyhow, Judgment of the Birds is probably his maybe his most famous essay. I think it's the most frequently anthologized um, piece there. But I've taught also The Flow of the River, which teaches well here because it's about the Platte and I've we've talked about the Platte River watershed and sort of get students involved with that. But my point being is, I think that the Immense Journeys definitely, as a book, his most significant book, and I think it also balances the sort of personal narrative and poetic style of writing with the scientific information better than some of his later materials do. Some of like books like The Invisible Pyramid say tend to feel a little bit like a professor's lecture rather than somebody telling you some interesting stories around the campfire, right? And so I think it strikes just the perfect balance between scientific information with some interesting narratives and anecdotes and probably I mean definitely some fabulous writing as well. So some of the like I said, some of the later ones are a bit professorial.
Well, I would probably disagree. I think probably the Star Thrower is probably his most famous essay because
That might be the most famous essay,
yeah,
although maybe for some of the wrong reasons. But
right, exactly. I was just going to say that because if you go into any like artsy parts of major cities, and you go into these stores that are sort of remnants from the '70s with
right,
beads hanging down, you can find not only that essay in some books, but sort of bastardized versions of it,
right.
condensed down, and it's almost become a modern myth in a something
Yeah,
in a
it
sense.
has. You see it on a lot of corporate websites for
Yeah,
sort of trying to show people that they're sort of what inspirational. It's read as an inspirational story, right? That if we
yeah,
all just do our little part, right, in the big cosmos, we can make some important change. And I think the story itself is far more complicated and
yeah,
far less um, obviously inspirational.
yeah.
That's really not Eiseley's message in any of his writing. I mean, I think he's much more um, circumspect
Yeah, it
and
sort of
much
reminds.
more. He's not writing fables in that way that a lot of people read the Star Throwers, though it were a fable that if we all
Yeah,
just we can't save all the starfish, but if we each throw in three or four,
yeah.
we can all collectively
It sort of
save them.
reminds me of like 1960s rock bands that wrote these songs against Vietnam or political causes, and then 25 years later they're used to sell a Chevy.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I think the story. I think it is one of his great pieces of writing. There's no
Yeah,
doubt about that. I think a lot of its popularity is based on a simplification of the message, or sort of a looking at a lot of it. And this is true in a lot of his writing. Is a sort of on the one hand this, but on the other hand that.
yeah,
And people often only look at the on the one hand that they prefer, then they don't look at the other hand in his writing. So I think
yeah,
that's a story that suffers from that. But in terms of a book, I would if somebody says, oh, I want to read some Loren Eiseley, what should I read? I would definitely say read The Immense Journey um, first. And I think the next work as a book of significance is The Night Country. I think
yeah,
that's sort of unified by tone and mood,
yeah,
way that the Immense Journey is unified by the story of evolution. The Night Country is more this sort of somber, dark. You'd mentioned earlier the stories. He tells a story in there about going out and seeing some boys finding a turtle and stoning it to death. And so that's sort of the dark side of experience. And it's almost I think that story is often taught as that sort of coming of age experience. Where a young child's first real awareness of evil in the world, right? And that's the night country there. And of course, the night country. When you're talking about Eiseley's biography earlier, he did suffer from insomnia, and so he was often up late at night. I think he did a lot of his writing late at night, and he would go for walks late at night. So he definitely had a affinity for the night country there, or the subterranean tunnels under cities as well.
Yeah, we will talk in our next segment about his influence on other science writers, but let's talk about him as his work in a literary sense. You mentioned, I believe, Tom, you had mentioned earlier, and Bing also mentioned about Ray Bradbury. Who were some of the peers in writing that he may have associated with, that he may have been influenced by or influenced? Did he have an influence, for example, Bing, on Bradbury reciprocally? Did Bradbury claim that he helped him maybe focus more scientifically? Because I actually, a night or two ago, watched an interview with Bradbury online from a cable show called Day at Night from the 1970s, where Bradbury gave a terrific interview. So who were his sort of peers literarily that he might have hung around with, or been associated with?
That's interesting you mentioned that. I did ask Ray Bradbury that question. Did Eiseley influence you? And he said, yes, he did. And I'm trying to think of which book may have had a profound interest in him. Of course, the Martian Chronicles talks about a vanished and dying civilization. So perhaps he may have been influenced by Eiseley. I'm trying to remember which of some of his other books may have influenced.
There is the scene in the Martian Chronicles that always I think of Eiseley is the one where the fellow is talking to a Martian and they're in different times. I forget what story that is, but it's like the Martian is thousands or maybe a million years ago, but they connect and they talk to each other, the human and the Martian, and that for some reason that always struck me as a very Eiseleyan moment in Bradbury.
Yeah. I mean, Eiseley's definitely a product of the space age. A lot of his writing is influenced by that. That's part of his sense of scale. You're talking about his sense of scale. He has this enormous sense of time scale and also spatial scale, and very much influenced by the space age, and writing about humans going into space. But he didn't have the triumphalist attitude towards traveling into space that was sort of prevalent at the time. He sort of brought in a more cautionary note that basically we've screwed up this planet. Why do we think we're going to go out in the world and out into the cosmos and not screw things up out there as well? So he was a little more dubious about the. I'm sure he was fascinated by it and pleased to see the moon landing and things of that sort. But still, he had this sort of an anxiety about the outcome of human travel into space.
Yeah, he uses the Philobulus, which is a fungus, as the human equivalent of our, in the last stages of our life on Earth. Like the Philobulus, it shoots its seeds into space, and we, in a similar manner, are trying to shoot our seeds into space. Perhaps human embryos tended to by a robot going to some distant planet, has certain themes similar to the recent release of the movie Interstellar, I think. And if people have seen that, as I was watching that movie, I was thinking Eiseley and his book, The Invisible Pyramid, where he warns, he's, as Tom says, very dubious about this enterprise, what it will end up with, and what remnants of a tattered humanity will remain. So he thinks it's possible he's not certain. He thinks that we really need to tend to business here at home and to defend what he calls the sunflower forest. And in fact, in the introduction to Invisible Pyramid, he talks about that this is a great adventure, and he does not know if humanity has the energy to both defend the sunflower forest and to follow the path on the beckoning trails to the stars. And so he questions this. And
when you were mentioning films, I was thinking of the film from his era, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is very, very Eisleyan in many ways, although I think more positive in its conclusions than he would be. But that sort of sense of human evolution, and that we're basically just clever apes, right?
Well, Tom, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I always had. I mean, not that Eiseley was a wide-eyed optimist, but do you think that Eiseley was? I mean, how would you describe his view of humanity in the long term? Do you think that he was a pessimist, or was he skeptical, or what?
I think he was pretty gloomy. Yeah, some of that was just. I think as he aged, he got a bit more gloomy just in his general outlook on life. But I think he was. He didn't have that sense that that was so much a part of that era, that the future is ours and everything will turn out for the best. He was also a product of the Cold War, and was writing when the idea of nuclear holocaust was still very much a concern that people had, and in that poem that the Innocent Assassins and that skull that being held up earlier is very much about. I see it as a sort of commentary on mutually assured destruction. These cats have these fangs and they kill each other and with them, and we and the Soviets have these missiles and we will kill each other with these missiles. I don't want to make him seem too pessimistic, but he certainly
hold it a little higher. Bing, there we go.
Yeah, he certainly wasn't a sort of triumphalist about the possibilities of the future and technology. He was pretty skeptical, I think.
Yeah. Well, let me end this segment here talking about the Loren Eiseley reader that the LES has put out, and I was given a free copy that's conducting this interview. So I've got you can hold that up there, and I'm looking through it, and it's got the foreword, the introduction, a bit of the bio. It's got 3 sections, and we have photos, a map of Eiseley's Nebraska, and his bibliography. So let's talk a little bit about this book. 2009 it was put together. Who did that, the editing? What was selected? What was the process of how to get this out? What was the aim of it? If either of you want to take that up.
Sure. The idea, partially inspired by Ray Bradbury, was we really needed to get Eiseley's writings out to a new generation of young readers. And we in the society considered this, and we thought perhaps it's time to reissue a collection of his essays taken from his many works. And so a group of us got together to make choices as to which essays could be incorporated. And so we have some about his early life, some about his reflectiveness, and then a number of essays related to mankind in the 20th century and where we're going as a species. So we've taken from a number of his works, and the process of receiving permission to reprint this was an interesting process. The publishers wanted upfront payment to accomplish this, and we appealed to the Eiseley family foundation, I guess, and they granted us permission to reprint the essays, and so we were able to obtain a Peter Kiewit Foundation challenge grant, which said we also had to do some very successful fundraising, we were able to accomplish this. And so 10,000 copies were published, and we have distributed these to every public library and school library within the state of Nebraska, and we have sufficient copies left over to continue to seed, to reseed Eiseley's legacy.
Yeah, it's a really good book, and just in case I hadn't mentioned it, it's www.eiseley.org, and that'll be below the video on YouTube here. Which it's in three parts: reflections of a naturalist, reflections of a writer, reflections of a wanderer. Did anyone have a specific hand in picking the? Was it edited by one person, or was it a group?
Well, we one of our two of the we had several people choosing these. I happened to be one of them. So the last 4 or 5 essays, probably I had the greatest hand in choosing. We had several others: Kira Gale, the former president of the society, and Deborah Derrick, and our longtime curmudgeon and historian of the group, Maury Tuttle, played a role, as did James Cook, or Jim Cook, had a role to play in the selection of the essays as well. So they're very long, drawn out series of discussions, and I think it matches the interests of as broad a group of the Eiseley board as we could manage.
Yeah.
And I think part of the criteria too was essays that would be high school student friendly.
Yes.
Some of Eiseley's work is probably a bit dense and over the head of students of that age. But the idea was to find works that would be teachable to sort of students in maybe middle school and high school age there. So that was one of the criteria as well. I actually came on late in the process. I sort of joined the board when this was already a project being undertaken.
Well, I just want to. Go ahead, Bing.
Last thing, Dan. One of my friends, who's an author back east, Leslie Nyman, read the rough draft of the book, and as she was reading it, Leslie said to me, Bing, exactly what Tom said. Look, Eiseley's a bit dense. You're going to have to do something if you're going to reach out to the children to have them read this. And so she proposed this, which is what we have been developing.
Okay.
It's a teacher's guide. And
Yeah.
so it is this teacher's guide that will be available online and available to teachers to use, that we are in the present course developing, as well as what's called an activities guide, which is, again, using the theme of the sunflower forest, except in this case, what we're doing is actually with Lawrence and Gardens here in Omaha, actually promoting the idea of young school-age children planting in their milk cartons a sunflower seed to build a sunflower forest on elementary school grounds, so that the children of the state will also have an experience similar and akin to what Eiseley had as a young boy wandering through the stream beds of Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yeah, Bing, I mentioned this to you when we talked earlier. When you held up those sunflowers, a few years back, my wife and I went to Big Bend National Park down in the spur of Texas, and it's bounded by 2 canyons. In the west, where the water flows in, there's a little path that goes up about a quarter of a mile into the canyon, and my wife was tired. She was just sticking her feet in the river, and I walked up there myself, and I felt like I was in that 1959 movie Journey to the Center of the Earth, because there were sunflowers literally about 15, 20 feet tall, and I felt like I was an ant. When you held that up, if you ever get down to Big Bend, you have to go to the canyon there, right the river. And the river is not that big or deep. But it was one of the most bizarre feelings, and when you were holding that up, it came to me. I also want to mention that I think All the Stranger Hours is probably the finest published autobiography, certainly in American history that I know of, and possibly in the English language. I think that's a fantastic work, and I think young readers, if they're not interested so much in science, but if people who want to read autobiographies, instead of reading all these vain biographies of these minor celebrities, this is a biography to read.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it is one of the more imaginatively recreated renditions of a life.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, it
and I
is.
don't say imaginative in terms of making stuff up, but I mean in terms of how to structure a story of your life,
Yeah,
and what themes to use to kind of organize it. And it's not, you were saying he hardly mentions his wife at all. It's not a kind of expose of his life. It's more the life of the mind in a way.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let us end this segment. When we get back, we'll talk about Loren Eiseley's writing and its influence on writers in the time since his death.